So this is the sixth in the UNDP Biodiversity Communications video series. And in this video, we're looking at the intersection of COVID-19 and the environmental crises facing us. Since this project started, COVID-19 has hit the world like nothing before. And it's profoundly changed the underlying nature of the environmental movement, the underlying nature of UNDP's work, and much of the social, economic and political fabric of our times. In this video, we're looking at the intersection of COVID-19 and the environmental crises. It's really an addendum to the core of this work, but it profoundly and fundamentally changes much of the subject matter.
So, just to kind of set out what we're going to go through in this video, there are sort of three areas, if you like. The first, we're considering story as strategy, and we're really going to be focusing on twin themes of rebirth as a story type and then trust. So how can stories help institutions rebuild trust in the way that they deal with COVID-19? We're obviously looking to create the strongest story possible. So we're going to be looking at the 9 building blocks and what can we learn from what's changing and the opportunities in front of us and how we should respond to them with story. And then also the importance of creating a story that can be aligned with many, many, many others so that we ensure that the narrative we're all working towards in terms of recovery and renewal from COVID-19 has nature-based solutions at the heart of it. So just as recap, we have, in terms of where this deck fits in, looked at the first 2 stages of the 5 stages of how you make change happen by using stories. That is the idea that we have got to replace a story with a better story. And that start point is knowing what stories people are already telling themselves about COVID-19. So in this sense, we're looking at the stories that the general public are telling themselves, that kind of corporations and governments are kind of telling. So popular stories, universal stories that are playing out through our media and social channels.
And so just again, to recap, you'll find a lot of this on other parts of the Better Nature and Stronger Stories websites. To recap, that narratives are essentially the big overarching ideas, and stories fit within or underneath narratives. They're accounts of real events and where people, for people where change happens. And so early on in coronavirus, we saw a narrative that come forward that was around washing your hands stops the spread. And we saw that manifest in a number of different ways, singing happy birthday, the pepper test, the way in which kids interacted with hand washing. And as we move forward again with COVID-19, the overarching narrative is coded as listen to the experts and we'll be able to get back to normal. And the stories that are coming out that fits to that narrative around government stimulus, the role of key workers, the role of corporates and the compliance of the general public. So what we've done over the course of the last few weeks is identify key and very specific stories related to coronavirus, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, code them onto the canvas, and then feed them en masse to develop a universal COVID-19 story.
Just to talk that through, the everyday hero, the citizens and communities that are being compliant, that are showing resilience, but also feeling vulnerable. The ordinary world, a sense that we're just getting by, and that you've got to look after yourself, communities looking after each other, but actually a sort of frustration, a growing frustration in kind of politics and other of the underpinning societal institutions. The villain in the kind of story is this coronavirus. It's malicious, it's super infectious, it's the invisible killer. The call to adventure and crossing the threshold together in one message are beat it together with social isolation. The mentors are the scientists and the experts who we need to listen to, and also those who are kind of further along in the kind of next phases. of tackling the disease. The allies, clearly all the kind of key workers and kind of very much, and for lots of those stories, that the kind of health service and key workers are heroes of their own stories and other people's as well as allies. The ordinary world, the three challenges that we've got to get from the ordinary world to the better world. Number one, protect lives. So save lives and kind of try and safeguard jobs, and then try and endure and kind of get through and exit lockdown. And what we're looking to do, and this is kind of key thing to flag, is to get life back to normal as quickly as possible with as many lives saved. And so there's a kind of a few things that really kind of stand out. The immediacy of the kind of villain is interesting to note in terms of story terms, because the fear in the short term can drive behavior, but we're starting to kind of see that wearing off as people sort of like challenging some of the kind of lockdown measures. But really it's this idea about getting life back to normal as kind of quickly as possible, which is the biggest both opportunity and threat to creating a different recovery and renewal story.
And so we see this universal COVID-19 story emerging as we travel up the sine wave of surge. Through pre-surge, we had a series of emerging and very different stories. In surge, and as we reach peak, this is very much the overarching story. People just want to get life back to normal. How that changes as we reach peak and go into a post-surge stage will be interesting to watch and try and influence. And so if you place this universal COVID-19 story within the context of the Three Horizons framework, which gives you a way to think about how societies, ideas, communities, economies, political systems can transition from declining business as usual to transformed future world states, we start to think about what are the underlying stories that will influence changes in the narrative that will support us towards a transition along the green line to a positive, transformed future world state, rather than reverting back to business as usual approaches with the associated pressures we see in climate breakdown and biodiversity collapse.
So that sort of first bit was looking at kind of a universal story. There are stories within stories within stories, and different tribes and sort of subgroups will be telling themselves different versions. So it is really interesting to look at the stories that the environment movement is talking about and telling themselves in relation to kind of COVID-19. The, I guess, elements to sort of pick out here, rather than kind of talk through it all, I guess, is discussions around the villain of the piece and actually kind of humanity's selfishness that has kind of triggered another invisible killer. The call to adventure very much being around the time for transformation. As Ben's talking about the Three Horizons, very much thinking about a kind of a better world which is sustainable. And as we're sort of going through to the better world, pulling out that the difference is that we don't want to return to normal. We don't want to go back to where we were before. Actually, this is the opportunity. We need to change the underlying values that underpin systems that determine the relationships that we have with each other, within society, with other species, with the kind of planet. And actually, we're looking for something that is healthier all round and certainly more sustainable. And in terms of elements to kind of pick out in terms of story terms, we're looking for things that are kind of interesting. We've mentioned the not returning to before. Certainly one of those ones which has been well documented and discussed in terms of looking to kind of avoid in communications is around the biggest threats to humanity, certainly for a large proportion of the population, the biggest threat is the immediate one of coronavirus, and climate breakdown and biodiversity collapse is something that just seems kind of far away and distant. But there are indeed useful elements within the story, and particularly the elevation and in some cases celebration of scientists and kind of experts and people's willingness to listen and kind of engage with them as people that can dictate the stories that we're telling ourselves, and also the people that are kind of stepping up and, of course, looking at the role of kind of key workers and health professionals that they might play in the environment story, but also looking at the innovators, the corporations that are kind of stepping in and making a meaningful difference at this time. They're certainly going to be useful allies in future story building. One of the things that we should and can conclude is that the environment movement story, as it was, is not a better story. So if you think about this idea about the only thing that can replace a story is a better story, a lot of the stories that we were telling ourselves, when we think back to sort of April to July time last year, we think about sort of XR declarations of climate emergency, those things are not as powerful as they once were. And indeed, there are lots of other stories that are pulling in the opposite direction, in particular those that are saying, please, let's get back to normal as quickly as possible. So some of the things that we are needing to be aware about, we talked about the biggest threats to humanity, and another interesting area, particularly in terms of storytelling tactics, is the one of civil disobedience. When you think that actually a lot of the success that we'll have, obviously that's relative, but the success that we'll have in kind of flattening the curve is about our obedience as citizens and as a civil society. So there's a sort of interesting tension between those two stories. And things that we can predict, we need to be aware of. We'll be needing to be thinking about the role that the environment move was judged to have played during the coronavirus. So time for reflection is kind of like really important, time for kind of planning, but also being visible and being out there, and making sure that we are focused on tangible transformations today, and that the stories of the environment movement are around cooperation and mobilization in terms of building these kind of like healthy systems and healthier relationships.
And so again, what you're starting to see is the idea of elements of an overarching environmental story set within the context of COVID-19 coming into play as we move through and past peak of surge, which we suggest in the next few slides, potentially utilizing key elements of the environment story, the positive elements of the environment story, and integrating them into the overarching or universal COVID-19 story as a potential way to really move environment issues into the main COVID-19 narrative, and increase the chance of us traveling along that green line into a positive, transformed world future.
So what I'd like you to do is kind of consider yourselves at this point as kind of story makers. So really we've been looking at the building blocks in terms of the craft of kind of story making and thinking about what's going to work, what's not going to work. But one of the really interesting opportunities that we've got at the moment is the chance to rebuild and kind of create a kind of a story that just simply wasn't possible a few months ago. And so regarding it as a bit more of a blank sheet of paper is certainly a positive first step. And so that's what we're going to do in this section. We're going to look at that blank sheet and we're going to start to fill in the boxes. One of the things that we've kind of picked up on and highlighted was that idea about not going back to life as it was beforehand. So focusing on the better world, what is it that we kind of want? Well, we've expressed it as life is better than it was before because of the healthier values, systems, and relationships. And even if we don't understand it in those terms, that's what we want people to kind of feel and kind of see around them because of the decisions that were made, because of the stories that were told at this point in time about how we recover and how we renew.
And we're starting to hear that in some of the stories that are coming out from organizations like the World Economic Forum and WRI around Build Back Better as one immediate case in point.
And just to sort of kind of break this down, when we think about an end goal of life is better than before, we think about who the hero might be in that kind of story. It's kind of clear that healthcare and professionals are going to remain as kind of heroes, and that added to that will hopefully be the kind of resilient communities and kind of their response and the kind of trust that exists within them, and the actions that were taken on, because of that trust. But also what we want is to make sure that government, businesses, and NGOs are also in that hero box, because they're so fundamental to creating that kind of better world. They need to find a way to be sort of elevated and become heroic through their actions. But if we kind of like looked at that sort of trajectory of the story where we go back to kind of life as normal, we see something happening in the opposite direction. So rather than becoming heroes, we sort of see a kind of a playing out of getting back to normal, where the villain goes from the disease, the virus itself, and then the impact of the virus, to actually being inclusive of the governments, the business, and the NGOs who missed the opportunity to do the right thing. And obviously we can kind of see that starting to kind of play out in the way that different nation states and their responses are being discussed and kind of played out and kind of shared. Who made the right decisions? When did they make the right decisions? What decisions were kind of missed? These are the sort of danger areas which could leave our groups of organizations that we want to be heroes to actually becoming the villains. And so what we're really talking about is making sure that we, our story has got to move from what looks like the government's becoming the villain to actually becoming the hero. So now we've got to work out how to do that. So what we've got to do is we've got to help them tell a better story. And then we've also got to help a lot of other people start to tell similar stories that align. And then we'll start to kind of shift that narrative. So as we sort of add to our box, we're going to put the environment movement in its kind of broadest sense in the mentor box, because they're going to help the government and businesses on this journey of change. And how they're going to do that, we're just going to dive a little bit deeper into this idea of trust and the role that it can play in kind of rebirth. So we're all super aware that the narratives, the big overarching ideas, are kind of shifting, and where they end up, how far and how dramatically they kind of shift is still to be determined, and it will be determined by the strength of the stories that are kind of told and kind of how many are told. But we need to kind of be aware of that, because obviously they all touch and get influenced by the actions of government, of businesses, of NGOs in each of these spaces, and many, many, many more.
And here we just got a few screenshots of examples of exactly that and how the narratives are shifting.
So by offering kind of rebirth and trust, we're going to allow governments to rebuild trust with the public, and that is at the heart of a story that will kind of shift. And we'll just quickly explain why rebuilding trust is so important. It's important because basically there is very, very little trust, and what trust there is eroding. So people grant their trust based on two attributes: competence and ethical behavior, which can really be described about doing the right thing and working to improve society. This is just one example. There's lots of trust barometer or trust indexes out there. They all suggest the same thing, which is none of the 4 societal institutions are trusted to do the right thing for our future. So what we want to be doing is making sure that we start telling stories that help governments rebuild trust, because we're helping them do the right thing to secure the future.
I think it's worth adding, this slide really should be governments, businesses and NGOs. It's the full gamut of institutions that we engage with.
So let's just sort of revisit the kind of storyboard and kind of see what that does to our building blocks. Here's what we're seeing. So for that heroic and mentor roles, we're looking for governments, businesses and NGOs. We're going to help them reconstruct better stories. We're going to celebrate partnership and innovation, and we're going to critically offer villains the chance of redemption. So it's not about pointing the finger unless it's about helping shift behavior. We can't back people into kind of corners. But that role of mentor, that opportunity that we've got with changing narratives and the stories we tell, needs to be about systems correction, and it needs to be about healthy relationships as we recover and renew. And so the biggest gift that the environment movement has is this idea of rebuilding trust, helping them rebuild trust. And the calls to adventure that we're starting to kind of see and emerge around building back better. The ordinary world is around these kind of broken systems in urgent need of fixing, and this rare opportunity that we've got to do so. And the thing that we need to defeat is the lack of trust. So we also talked about some of the things that we need to either avoid, be aware of, or start focusing on. So we identified those different stories, and we also identified elements within them that we'd want to carry through into kind of creating a new story. And
importantly here, we've identified there are clearly new allies with gifts to bring to these stories. While it's restricted to US professions, the left-hand graph is fascinating in that it looks at the most and least trusted professions in the US, and our scouting around this area suggests this is more or less representative globally, with medical professionals the most trusted people in society.
So clearly they're going to play important roles in providing the kind of help that we need practically, but also showcasing the behavior that we kind of want to see exhibited on a kind of journey of change. And then thinking back to the really sort of positive parts of the environment stories that are already being told in relation to kind of COVID-19, we have our kind of 3 challenges. So first and foremost, everyone agrees it's about saving lives, but it's also about protecting the vulnerable. That's a very, very important social justice part of any transition or any recovery and renewal. It's about inspiring new thinking, making new connections, and then it's about mobilization. And that's got to be for kind of real alternatives that have got to be delivered and visible to all. And then we start to kind of see that we've kind of got the building blocks that we need to create stronger stories. So this really is the kind of template that we're looking to then find the examples that bring this to life, that we can cascade, that we can share, that we can start spreading faster.
So if we can activate this whole COVID-19 environment story and think about how we can elevate that to a position essentially of, I hope I've got the terminology right, but essentially of narrative, and then how many stories that align with that overarching COVID environment story can work together in concert to transform the current, what we call universal COVID-19 story, and support the overarching story system, move us all away from a return to business as usual and towards a new transformed future state.